Thank you so much, Robin. How are we? Are we good? Oh. My voice isn't quite as loud as yours is, Neva, so I probably need... You're amazing. Neva Hassanin, among so many of my mentors and teachers here in this room. And it really is special to be back here full circle 7 years after that AERO meeting in 2015. And to be with you all in the context of an organization and a community that has meant so much to me and my life and my work, from which I've learned a great deal. And I'm just grateful to all of you who have shared with me over the years your own stories and your own wisdom, which is really so much of the reason why I'm up here, is that you have been so generous in allowing me to carry those stories through books like Lentil Underground and Healing Grounds in my classroom. And I just want to say before I get started how inspired the people that I've had the chance to work with as a teacher have been when they hear about the work that AERO members are doing, and so many of you who I can see here in the crowd this evening, and some of you who I have yet to meet. So it really is an honor to be here, and also really joyful. I'm really glad to be here with my parents, Lynn and Ray Carlisle. Who were also here with me in 2015, and maybe you remember them tearing it up at the ping pong table in the lodge. So thank you so much for the invitation and for the warm welcome. I'd just like to share a few passages from Healing Grounds with you. I'm going to share a little bit from the introduction. I'm going to share a little bit from the first chapter, which features Latrice Tatsy, who is here with us at AERO and will be speaking tomorrow. And then just a little bit from the end of the book as well. This book really has built on everything that I've learned from talking with folks in the AERO community, sort of starting with, hey, you know, I'm a girl who was born and raised in Montana. What can we do to confront climate change and take better care of land? Thinking about my own family's story and lineage and journey, my grandmother losing a family farm in the Dust Bowl, thinking about what does soil health and land care have to do with sustainable human communities as well. And so in writing this book, I've really been thinking a lot about how everything that we do in communities like AERO and working towards regeneration really stands on the shoulders of thousands of years of work in global indigenous communities, including communities indigenous to Montana and to this continent, as well as communities indigenous to Africa and Asia and other parts of the Americas, many of whom are in diaspora in this country and bringing that wisdom and those traditions in really important ways to the work of regeneration. So I'll just share a little bit with you from the introduction here about how I sort of came to work on this book, and then a little bit from the chapter featuring Latrice, a little bit from the conclusion, and then we'll all share some delicious food together. So here we go. Healing Grounds. As researchers have now known for decades, the majority of the carbon stored in forests around the world isn't sequestered in trees, but in the soil below. Globally, soils constitute a carbon repository some 3 times as large as the amount of carbon stored in all the plants on Earth. This soil carbon sink is also 3 times larger than the amount of carbon currently in the atmosphere. And there's good reason to think that with the help of plants, our soils could be holding even more carbon, a lot more. The main reason soils aren't already holding more carbon is agriculture, or more precisely, industrially farmed monocultures. Over thousands of years, and especially the last 200 or so, carbon once stored in soils has been released to the atmosphere through overgrazing, plowing, and loss of soil fertility, as soils have been mined for their nutrients and left bare between plantings, prone to erosion. Researchers estimate that some 133 gigatons of carbon have been released as a result, approximately 8% of total global soil carbon stocks. The IPCC report and many of its readers started asking whether a different kind of agriculture might be able to repay the debt and put some of that carbon back. And as I started thinking about these questions, I started wondering about this kind of regenerative agriculture and whether it was being widely practiced or if it had thrived in the past. Might there be a precedent for regenerative agriculture that could help people trying to create such farming systems now? I had an inkling of such a history, having studied the organic movement, but it was the kind of situation where I knew just enough to realize that there was a lot I didn't know. To my amazement, I found that practices commonly promoted within regenerative circles as new innovations had been used for many hundreds, and in some cases, thousands of years, not just in faraway ancient civilizations, but continuously and right here on the North American continent. Accompanying these practices were sophisticated analyses of soil health, as well as guidelines for stewarding it. Some of these regenerative farmers, though I came to understand them by other terms that they themselves used, were indigenous to these lands. Others had migrated here, bringing knowledge and seeds with them. But once I began learning to recognize the signature of their influence on the North American landscape, I started seeing it everywhere. In places that few agricultural researchers ventured to look, vacant lots, immigrant neighborhoods, Native American reservations, regenerative agriculture kept periodically popping up, like a desert superbloom after a spring rain. This left me with a pointed, haunting question. Why weren't these regenerative farmers more securely established? If putting down roots was the key to a climate-friendly food system, what was preventing these people with regenerative farming know-how from doing so? Or had they been uprooted? At this point, I realized that I needed to examine the story of US agriculture, a story I thought I knew, through a lens other than my own. I became intensely curious about what farmers and communities of color might teach me about how to work toward healing on the land. When I asked the question this way, a rich landscape of regenerative agriculture began to come into view. I spoke with indigenous Montanans working to restore native prairie and bring home their bison relatives. I talked to returning generation Black farmers, reaching back to their African heritage to inform new agroforestry initiatives. A Chicana soil ecologist, herself the child of farm workers, showed me the results of her research with immigrant Mexican and Hmong farmers in California's Central Valley, whose highly diverse small farms were teeming with beneficial fungi. The more I learned, the more I came to see that regenerative agriculture was neither a relic nor a fantasy. It had always been here, but on the margins. Pushed to the edges of industrial agriculture, these practices had been sustained by people pushed to the edges of society. This was not just a story about regeneration, but also one about liberation, and the two were powerfully intertwined. As I learned from farmers, scholars, and advocates who had spent lifetimes digging into these buried stories, some of them looking into their own families' pasts, the regenerative farming traditions of their ancestors had been suppressed, but never fully snuffed out. Carefully tended in the gardens of the enslaved and the murals of the landless, these traditions had provided both material subsistence and another form of sustenance that was difficult to put into words. There had been centuries of this survival work, seeds braided into hair and smuggled across borders, passed down generation to generation. Bison and their human relatives, confined to reserves, dreaming of reunion on their ancestral lands. Milpas on the edges of farm fields, New Year's meals of black-eyed peas, networks for sharing harvest labor. All these practices had persisted despite the confines of structural racism. Might this moment of climate crisis be their time to blossom? And so, with that beginning, I got to talk to 4 incredibly powerful, brilliant women. Latrice Tatsey, who's here with us, and I'll read just a little bit from the beginning of that chapter. Also Olivia Watkins, who is in North Carolina, stewarding a forested piece of property that's been in her family since 1890. Her great-great-uncle was one of the first Black landowners in the area, and she is pursuing agroforestry and forest farming. She's been growing mushrooms and raising bees in the understory of the forest, conserving this diverse forest land, which is threatened in the rapidly urbanizing Raleigh-Durham Chapel Hill triangle, but also conserving threatened Black-owned land, which has been threatened by all sorts of racist processes over the last 100 years. I also got to speak with Aide Guzman, the Chicana soil ecologist that I just referenced, who has an incredible story. Her parents had to leave their family's small diversified family farm in Mexico due to all of the economic disruption associated with the Green Revolution and NAFTA, and came to the Central Valley of California to be farm workers. So Ida grew up in the belly of the beast of industrial agriculture, seeing it from the laborer's perspective. But she got to travel to her family's small farm in Mexico when she was 9. And that experience inspired her to study agroecology and soil ecology. And she's just completed a first-of-its-kind study with immigrant farmers in the Central Valley from Mexico and Central America, but also Hmong refugees from Southeast Asia, and has demonstrated for the first time in this way that their very diverse farming systems also create biodiversity below ground in ways that facilitate soil health and all the processes that help with carbon sequestration and balanced nutrient cycles. And then I also got to speak with Nikiko Masumoto, who is the 3rd generation on her family's stone fruit farm in the Central Valley, growing peaches and nectarines and apricots. Her father converted the farm to organic, Mas Masumoto, early person in the organic movement. And it was her grandparents who bought the farm just after they were released from the concentration camps that this country created during World War II for people of Japanese American heritage for no reason other than their Japanese American background. And she speaks really powerfully about the radical act of her family literally putting down roots in this soil and investing in soil health, believing that they could belong to this place, even with everything that they had been through, and that they could create thriving spaces for all of their neighbors. So I just want to read you this short passage from the first chapter, just a little taste of the incredible wisdom that was generously shared with me in my conversations with Latrice Tatsey, and you'll hear much more from her tomorrow. So chapter 1, Return of the Buffalo. Technically speaking, it was nearly summertime when Latrice Tatsey drove out to the Blackfeet Buffalo Ranch to dig the first soil pits for her graduate research. But having grown up on the Blackfeet Reservation, a dramatic convergence of mountains and prairie along the Canadian border in northwest Montana, Tatsey knew she could encounter any kind of weather during June fieldwork. As the wind whipped up, she pulled a gray sweatshirt over her head, cinching the hood around her face to shield herself from both the chill and the soil, which kept gusting into her eyes. Once she managed to dig a foot down into the chilly buffalo pasture, Tatsy stretched her body full length onto the earth, peering into the sink-sized hole. Here, in the deep recesses of the soil, she hoped to find clues about how her people had lived in balance with this prairie for thousands of years, and how that balance might be restored. Tatsy's path to bison ecology started when she was a young girl, growing up on a cattle ranch and going to rodeos with her dad. As a member of the Blackfeet Nation, or Amskapi Pikani, as Latrice's people call themselves, she was given the name Iniskamaki, Buffalo Stone Woman. At first, I was really upset, Tatsy recalls, because I really loved horses and I wanted my name to have something to do with that. But as Tatsy got older, she began learning the story of Buffalo Stone Woman. As elders shared with Tatsy, there had once been a very hard time, a starvation time, when the Blackfeet people couldn't find the buffalo and were running out of sustenance. One day, a woman went out to gather wood and came upon an iridescent dark gray stone. When she picked it up, she was given a song to sing. The woman brought both the stone and the song back to her people, teaching others to sing with her. The next day, when they went out to hunt, they found the buffalo again. When I first heard that story, I was like, oh, wow, Tatsy recalls. And I thought, maybe this isn't such a bad name after all. Tatsy began dreaming of raising buffalo on her family's ranch, mentally superimposing the image of a herd onto the view out her window. I would say, Grandma, you know where you see all your cattle? Tatsy recalls. One day, I'm going to bring buffalo out there. After finishing her undergraduate degree in natural resources, Tatsy landed a position with the Agricultural Extension Service, administering U.S. Department of Agriculture programs for the Blackfeet community. Her job gave her ample opportunities to visit the tribe's growing buffalo herd, which stoked her curiosity about the animals. Tatsy realized she had lots of questions about these native herbivores and their role on the landscape, but not nearly enough answers. So in 2017, she went back to school, this time for a graduate degree in environmental science at Montana State University, which is how she found herself staring into a soil pit and trying to keep the dirt from blowing up her nose. Only by looking underground, Tatsy told me, can you fully appreciate the key role that buffalo play on this carbon-rich but fragile prairie. By comparing soil samples from the tribal buffalo ranch and an adjacent cattle ranch, Tatsy hopes to document some of the interactions between buffalo and soils, which have important implications for the climate. We tend to think of grazing as a process of using up a finite resource, Tatsy explained. But for buffalo and most other native herbivores, it's more of a mutual relationship with plants. By selectively grazing over long distances, buffalo helped create one of the most ecologically productive landscapes in North America. Looking up from her soil pit, Tatsy can see for miles across this ancient prairie, 1.5 million acres of which still belong to the Blackfeet people, an area slightly larger than the state of Delaware. Rising up behind her, the Rocky Mountains create an edge effect on the Blackfeet Reservation, a zone of overlapping habitats that hosts some 80% of Montana's large vertebrates. Our people call it the backbone of the world, Tatsy says. To the many other species that call these prairies home, the buffalo's forage-boosting behavior means more food. But for humans in the 21st century, the impacts of buffalo grazing may have another important implication. When you have healthier plant species, Tatsy says, they are taking more CO2 out of the atmosphere and bringing it back into the soil profile, which potentially means buffalo could help us respond to climate change. So I'll leave it there and let you hear directly from Latrice tomorrow, or if maybe you grab her over dinner this evening. And I just want to share a short passage from the end of the book to give you a sense of some of what was in my heart following these conversations with these 4 women that I've really carried with me since researching this book, and as we've continued to have conversations with podcasts and going to conferences together, some of what I saw as this emergent wisdom from not only the 4 women that I spoke with, but the really powerful communities that they all come from. So this last section is called Healing Grounds. As I spoke with the trio of land justice advocates, I realized how fully my understanding of regenerative agriculture had shifted. In the beginning, I'd pored over research papers about carbon sequestration and soil organic matter, trying to pin down the potential for agricultural climate solutions in technical terms. Then I started visiting farmers, hoping to learn about the regenerative practices they were implementing to capture carbon and reduce emissions. But when it became clear to me that many of the communities with the strongest commitments to a regenerative food system were lacking secure access to land, I had to take a step back. It wasn't just individual farming practices standing in the way of agricultural climate solutions. It was our society's entire way of relating with land and with each other. The extraction of carbon from soils was just one integral piece of a much larger process of extraction. A process that included the theft of indigenous lands, the forced enslavement of millions of Africans, and the extortion of immigrant labor. To repair the soil, we needed to repair it all. I had been preoccupied with a narrow question. How many tons of carbon can farmers suck out of the atmosphere and store underground? Pinning down this number proved elusive. As scientists pointed out, the dizzying array of variables involved, from soil types to crop varieties to the length of time you assumed a particular form of management would be sustained. Truthfully, they admitted, we're just beginning to understand how to measure the movement of this tiny, consequential element. What we do know, however, is that carbon cycling works pretty well in healthy, functioning ecosystems. Wondering if I'd failed to look at the most fundamental question underlying my whole project, I eventually asked Stephanie Morningstar, one of the other wonderful, powerful women I got to interview for this book, a very unformed question. I'm sure the words didn't come out in this order, but the essence of it was this. So, what is the climate crisis? I mean, really. This is ancestor work, Morningstar answered. Everything that we're doing is ancestor work. Not just me, not just Black folks, not just people of color, everybody. Climate change signals a profound imbalance, Morningstar explained, rooted in the violent restructuring of relationships between people and land that lies at the very heart of this continent's history. This rupture disrupted the connections that make healthy, functioning ecosystems possible, including the connections that weave humans into the fabric of a place. That means the vital work of rebuilding soil carbon is inextricably woven together with the vital work of racial justice. What we are doing is we are healing our ancestral lineages, Morningstar clarified. It's about going back to the root issues, indigenous land dispossession and enslavement. How do we right those relationships between our own communities so that we can heal those things in this healing ground? So healing the climate means healing land, I asked, trying to follow Morningstar's train of thought. And healing land means healing colonization? That's it, Morningstar said. That's the work. So that's a little bit of Healing Grounds. Again, I'm super delighted to be here with all of you. I think we might have a little bit more time before dinner. And I'm totally happy to take any questions that you have. I mean, or you can challenge my parents to a game of ping pong, but.
I'll ask one.
Awesome. Thank you, Eva.
You write the book as a way to, and you kind of present this foil of, I was on this journey trying to answer these questions. And that really works really well. And I'm wondering where else the idea came from for the book, and the way that you read the different stories and histories of peoples who live here today and their ancestors, as you say. So can you say a little bit more about where that came from?
Yeah, I think, so I haven't been doing this work quite as long as Neva has. But I've been at it about 12 years as a researcher and writer focused on sustainable agriculture. Now sometimes we use the word regenerative. I've known a lot of people part of the organic movement. And so I think that's definitely led to a lot of reflection about where does this movement come from and where are we going and how do we meet our goals. And I think that as I've seen a lot more conversation in really mainstream media and other powerful spaces about the connection between regenerative agriculture and climate change, I've also seen that people in the research field have very differing views of how much of climate change might be tackled through these regenerative agriculture techniques. And I was very curious about that gap between some colleagues of mine who feel that, a quarter to a third of human-caused greenhouse gas emissions could be offset through a large-scale transition to regenerative agriculture. And other colleagues of mine who've written commentaries in big scientific journals who say, oh man, like 5% at best, and maybe not even that, and this is really just greenwashing by General Mills, trying to talk you into the idea that if you buy this cereal that you're gonna have an impact on the planet. So I was really interested in that gap between really all of these are people who I would consider kindred spirits in many ways, but who have widely differing views of how powerful the organic, regenerative, sustainable agriculture movement is as a response to climate change. And I think something that I saw again and again is that initiatives that were rooted in indigenous communities, communities of color, were talking about regeneration in a very deep sense that went to root causes around what is our society's relationship with land? Do we have an extractive relationship with land, or do we have a reciprocal relationship with land? And so what I saw was that approach to regeneration is really powerful and really can have a very significant impact in our climate future. And we're at this inflection point, I think, in terms of there's a lot of energy going into regenerative agriculture. There's potentially a lot of public funding. There's certainly a lot of eaters out there who want to support a regenerative movement that really has legs. And so I wanted to write a book that talked about regeneration in that deep sense as our whole society shifting our relationship with land from being extractive to being reciprocal. And that really featured these leaders coming from indigenous communities and global indigenous communities, communities of color, in ways that highlight not only all the incredible contemporary work in these communities, but also the ways in which it's rooted in thousands of years of cover crops in China and agroforestry in Africa and milpas in Mexico and Central America. Because I think another pitfall sometimes of regenerative agriculture as it's perceived sometimes in mainstream media or more mainstream spaces is that it's something brand new rather than coming out of deep cultural knowledge. And so those were definitely some of the thoughts in my mind as I was working on the project about what I hoped it might add to this conversation. Yeah. Yeah, thanks, Neva.
Hi, Liz.
Hi.
Steve Thompson.
Hi,
Good to
Steve.
see you.
Good to see you too.
Yeah, you're such a wonderful storyteller, and I just want to thank you for that style. It's not so common in academia, and you've chosen that path, and you're going to do wonderful. We were out at Timeless Seed today, and that really first time I've been there. And
Cool.
Really brought Lentil Underground to life. And they're doing great.
Yeah.
Which is awesome. And hung out with Charlie today, who's working on about Queensland. And that's a wonderful story. And of course, the trees and the whole what's going on with the INI initiative. So thank you. But you also work for our wonderful U.S. Senator, John Tester. So I'm going to have to ask you about policy.
Yes.
Okay? What are we going to do about this farm bill? And what can we do? We have 2 more years of Senator Tester, and we have the Farm Bill coming up, which is going to be the main focus in agriculture for the next 2 years for sure. What should we do to make sure that maybe Senator Tester continues to serve for us and to also pass a good Farm Bill?
I'm so glad you asked that question. Spot on. Obviously, you're very rich in this community with strategic thinkers who know, where the leverage points are and windows of opportunity in particular moments. So I am really excited about this Farm Bill cycle. And, we only get this opportunity once every 5 years for the Farm Bill to be reauthorized. If that, sometimes it's 6 years, right? It might be 2024 by the time this one ultimately.
It's very important.
Yes, it's really important. And especially when we think about an issue like climate change, how many more cracks do we get at the Farm Bill during the window of time when we really have a shot to impact the climate trajectory? So I think we need to go all in. I think all of your voices need to be heard on this Farm Bill. I'm really excited about a campaign that was just announced about 2 weeks ago. It's called the Transformative Farm Bill Campaign. A mentor of mine, Ricardo Salvador from the Union of Concerned Scientists Food and Environment Program, is an important part of that campaign, but there's 170 organizations who participated in the launch. But it's going to continue through 2024. I think AERO's voice would be really important here. And what I love about this campaign is that as long as I've been involved in talking about federal policy around agriculture, the approach to the Farm Bill has always been to take the last Farm Bill and the way it was structured and kind of edit it, like I might try to do with one of my students' papers, and say, well, okay, we have the Farm Bill. Can we add a little bit of money for the Environmental Quality Incentives Program or the Conservation Stewardship Program, or maybe some of the programs that support our local and regional food systems initiatives? But as long as I've been doing this work, we've never really gone at the core of the Farm Bill. I think we've always kind of asked for stuff around the margins of it to support the work that we're all doing. And this campaign is finally saying, this thing that people have been calling the alternative food system, this is the food system. This is the only food system that is taking care of the land and meeting people's nutritional needs. We need to do more than just treat this as something on the margins. This should be at the core of the Farm Bill. So this Transformative Farm Bill campaign is asking actually the White House, which I think is very interesting. It's a letter written to President Joe Biden, not to Congress, saying we want a Farm Bill that reflects your values. So that's the strategy in it, is they're saying, hey, President Biden, you've already come out and said you support these things. The Farm Bill is the vehicle to do it if you want to take action on climate and if you want to take action on equity and nutrition, right? They just had this huge White House summit on countering hunger. And so, what this coalition of groups identified is that, yeah, Congress writes the Farm Bill, but President Biden has to sign it. And he has used that influence in a big way in the last couple of years to shape legislation that has changed quite a bit in those kind of final days of negotiation to meet the White House's standards for what they're willing to sign. So there's going to be a letter writing campaign that's going to go straight at the executive branch. Also recognizing that the rulemaking that happens in the Department of Agriculture is that devil in the details even after the legislation gets passed. So I'm really excited about that campaign. I'm excited about the idea of not just asking for little edits to the Farm Bill, but asking for, let's go back to the drawing board. Yeah. Yeah, I mean, this is $500 billion of our taxpayer money, right? So we want to see all of it go towards the values that we believe in. And I'm going to be really active in this, and feel free to email me at any point about it. Yeah.
Liz, I'm guessing you get a lot of students who are interested in soil and water and food.
Mm-hmm.
So how do you try to direct them to an approach that's relationship-based in a way, that we might be able to learn from too?
Yeah, I mean, I think the students have actually directed me to an approach that's relationship-based. That's another thing that I was thinking about in response to your question, Neva, about like other parts of the origin story of this book is partly that I'm also in conversation with my students. And so I'm thinking about what they're challenging me, the framework they're challenging me to kind of get to based on what they know and the communities that they come from. And so I think, honestly, for a lot of the students that I work with at UC Santa Barbara, I've had a lot of students come up who say, like, I'm from the Central Valley, and agriculture means a lot of things to me. On the one hand, I see that it's like my community's economic lifeblood. On the other hand, it's like poisoning my drinking water. So I think that, honestly, for a lot of the students I work with, it does start with relationships, and that's actually what gets them excited about going to a soil science class or a class dealing with water quality, is those, the human significance that they've already seen in their own life experience. I think, for students who are coming more from that fascination with the natural world, that is itself a relationship. And that was something that, a real aha moment that I had working on the Lentil Underground project, is that the experience of learning deeply about the ecology of that kind of diversified cropping system and the way the legumes were working and the way the cover crops were working. There were so many life lessons in that cropping system. And the farmers that I met who had transitioned to those cropping systems, they were telling me about those principles that they were continually sort of learning from their relationship with the natural world. And so I also see that in some of my students who come from this place of deep curiosity about the ecosystems themselves. Yeah.
Hey, Liz, to go back to the policy thing again, about 10 years ago at AERO, or I guess maybe a little more than that, we heard Wes Jackson talk. And he, my first initial real introduction to soil carbon and that issue. They were working quite hard on policy. Wes Jackson and Wendell Berry and Fred Kirschman, they all approached two or three farm bills ago, said we need to basically change this.
Right.
You don't see it happening. There's a lot of dysfunction in Congress.
Right.
You see it across the board in not just farm issues, but all the issues.
Yeah.
So the challenge, I think, for you and John is going to be breaking that deadlock and actually having open, transparent debate and not having all these backroom, last-minute omnibus budgets passed. And like you say, all it is a reworking of the current bill.
Yeah, and I think that 50-year Farm Bill vision that those folks put out was really important in I think catalyzing a lot of us to think more ambitiously about what we were asking for. And I think you're absolutely right about the kind of that there's a deeper challenge around our democracy and the health of our democratic processes. And so that work is all really, really important stuff too. And I think in talking with Ricardo and other mentors who've been working on this transformative Farm Bill campaign, that's exactly one of their thoughts, is that the Farm Bill in particular has often been done in backroom deals because so many Americans don't think this bill is for them. Yeah. There has been, I think, this misperception about who is the farm constituency rather than the idea that, like, hey, everybody needs clean water to drink. everybody needs clean air to breathe, and we all eat. So we all have a stake in this bill. And this is probably the biggest piece of climate legislation that's going to come across President Biden's desk, potentially for the rest of his presidency. So I think bringing it out of that kind of backroom space where I think a lot of members of the public aren't even really aware of it, and convincing, and this coalition is sort of the mind that the White House is maybe the most receptive audience to this, convincing them that the public isn't going to let them do this as just, hey, we talked to a few farm state legislators and some industry people, that the public expects this to be one of the pieces of legislation that is responsive to public opinion. And I think about what happened recently with the Inflation Reduction Act, and specifically what just happened with, the deal that the Democratic Party had made with Senator Joe Manchin, that if they passed the Inflation Reduction Act, that they would also pass the permitting reform that Manchin wanted in order to make it easier to permit fossil fuel projects. And it was the only reason that did not happen, and it just got killed in the last week, is because there was this massive popular effort to daylight this whole negotiation process and say, no, we don't want this permitting reform. We want a climate bill, period. We don't want a climate bill with like a fossil fuel thing like buried in it. So that gives me a lot of hope that we can do the same kind of thing on the farm bill, that if we say, no, we're not willing to just have this be a few people who get a lot of agribusiness donations who go and negotiate what this bill is going to look like, that we, the public, expect this to be a bill that's responsive to our needs. And I know that's a long game, and a lot of you have been playing it for a really long time. But I am fired up about this farm bill cycle, that this is a chance for us to move the needle on that. Yeah.
I have a question totally outside of politics, out of the political arena. So in the third book, in this book, you profiled these people and told their stories. And they were very powerful stories. And even in your book, you talked about them trying to participate in programs in California where they really just could not. So my question is, and my curiosity has been, after reading that and just knowing others in that area, what do you think about their opportunities outside the political arena to empower themselves by coming together? Because I've never seen them really come together, the groups that you talked about and others, so that does not happen, so that they can keep their land, so that they can educate us about their knowledge. They're so hidden. And when I got done with this book, your book, it was just like you just wanted to scream to say, you have the knowledge. We do not have the knowledge. Teach us, but they have to be free. I guess it must be free to do so. So at the end of when you wrote it, how do you see them still just staying so much to themselves, or do you see them coming together in any possible way?
Yeah, well, there's a really uncomfortable truth. Oh, that's kind of long. I'll try. Yeah, I mean, I think the heart of the question is, whether communities of color engaged in these regenerative agriculture initiatives rooted in, these really, really deep traditions and knowledge, why do we see still so many barriers to that? And I think a really uncomfortable truth that I just had to face over and over and over again researching this book is there is a huge disparity in access to land and capital. 98% of agricultural land in the United States is white-owned, and it's not an accident. It's because of these historical processes of indigenous land dispossession, enslavement, and exploitation of immigrant agricultural labor without people having opportunities to become landowners. And there's also this massive racial wealth gap. as a result of processes that are not super dissimilar. Some of them specific to agriculture, some of them not specific to agriculture. So that's something we really have to face as a society when we look at who has opportunities in agriculture to carry out these regenerative practices. And I do think that there have to be some efforts through policy and the political process and the public sphere. And also, Olivia Watkins, who's featured in the second chapter of this book, she's now the president of something called Black Farmer Fund. And something she talks about is that there was a public process that was intended to help Black farmers finance their operations, but because it was administered through local committees, and this is in the mid-20th century, that were extremely racist, Black farmers didn't get the loans that they were entitled to the tune of lots and lots and lots of money that Black farmers lost because of the racist administration of these USDA programs. And so because of that legacy, what Olivia has found is that a lot of the really, really promising Black regenerative farming operations that she would like to support, they've lost trust in any kind of public financing because of this historical experience. And so she, with her mentor Karen Washington, who maybe some of you know of, she's like a legendary urban gardener in New York, who now has her own farm outside of the city called Rise and Root, they created this organization called Black Farmer Fund, inviting people to invest in this fund that they've created that then creates financing options for regenerative Black farmers who don't trust the public programs and who don't have access, for all the reasons that maybe any of you have tried to get loans from conventional ag loans to do regenerative practices, you know how that goes sometimes, that they need a financing source that's really tailored to their needs, and that it's really an invitation to anybody with capital who wants to do a sort of slow money type of investment to invest in this fund. And so they already raised their first $1 million, and they have their first cohort of 8 incredible Black food and farm operations. They just did a video series. So I do think there's a really important role also for civil society and organizations that are operating outside of the public sector to think about how communities of color and indigenous communities are going to access land and capital to do all of these things, given the historical experience that people have had of being denied those things. I see a hand over here. Yes, is that Joseph?
Yeah.
Hi, Joseph.
I'll try to follow up on the questions that you've received today, and I don't know, I'll try my best to bring my points in form of a question. So, of the books that you've written, including these healing grounds, which you followed, is it 4 people or 3 people?
Yeah.
The people you've spoken to, those whom you've written about, are the people who've taken ownership. They've realized that there is a problem, they've taken ownership, and they want to bring about change, starting with them, saying, we are going to do it, I'm going to do it. And then all of a sudden, through that, they've been able to influence either their families or their friends and neighbors to join in. I look into this room and I think there is a good number of young people. And you being in a university setup, you meet with young people. What would be the best way to make young people really see this problem as something that's affecting them? Because climate change is going not to affect, it's not about the old generation so much, but the younger generation and the future. For us to address the challenges, I feel like the young people need to embrace, to understand the magnitude of the problem, and then once they own it, they can choose to influence, to cause a change. Somebody spoke about the farm bill, which is a very big thing. It's a it's a super huge thing, but it's been left to the politicians to handle it. Interested, or what I will say, what will it be? Interest groups, people who have some interest. But I feel like the young people need to really become, I think radical would be a very strong word, but I would use that.
Yeah.
To become radical enough to say, I'm going to support what would affect my environment, either in the food that I eat or the things that I do, and I'm going to use my voice. So what is the best approach? I don't know.
That's a great question, Joseph. How do we empower all of these youth leaders who I think are as ready as anybody in our society to take a path of healing and regeneration and reciprocal relationships with their human and more than human relatives? I think for me, a lot of it has to do with really checking myself and thinking about how am I getting out of their way? Am I to avoid the ways in which I probably unconsciously limit because of the assumptions I make or the world I'm used to? How do I, as best as possible, really hear when one of my students is presenting what sounds to me like a very radical vision and is probably right on, that feels challenging to me or threatening to me? So I think that's a big part for those of us who are no longer young people, is just being humble and getting ready to take that leadership. And then also I think about, similarly, I think there's this disparity of resources challenge that is another limit in addition. Yes, I see people, it's like, are we ever gonna buy a house? I mean, I don't know, right? Are we even gonna be able to afford like housing, like just some of these basic things? There's this huge generational divide right now because of sort of what's happened in the financial sector, and some choices I think that we've made about how our economy is structured. So I think also some of it is like, how do we materially empower young people to have the freedom to follow their dreams in the way that even I did? It's not that long ago that I was a college student, and I could access really inexpensive housing that allowed me to follow my dreams with very little encumbrance. And some of that has to do with the privilege I inherited, but a lot of that has to do with the fact that I could access a sort of simpler, low-cost lifestyle that allowed me to write Lentil Underground and pursue what was in my heart. And so I think a lot about that when I meet my students and they have 2 jobs and they work 40 hours a week and they're also in school. It makes it hard, I think, to pursue the dreams that they have and to kind of follow the wisdom that's in their heart. So I think there's also that challenge, is how do we make sure that young people can access the things that they need, including housing, so that they can focus on the things that they know are really important. Is it dinner time yet? Am I cutting into? Okay.
Such a good wrap up, Robin. I'm good at that. So thank you, Liz, so much.
Yeah.
Always, when your books and hearing you speak is always just so inspirational. But I think what we have right here is a body of action. And AERO has always been a body of action. AERO has developed so many deep roots in our Montana communities and beyond, and have provided leadership in these areas. So when you speak about young people, we have a lot of young people in this room. It's time to AERO to help pull them together. And we create those paths of action. And we've done it in the past. I look across this room and I see people that I go, that happened, that happened, that happened.
Yeah.
And it came out of the AERO community. So AERO, let's pick up our boots and let's go. Because we have a lot of stuff to work on. So that's what, David, right? We put our heads together and we make some stuff happen. So thank you so much for spurring us on.
Thank you, Jan. And yes, I'm really excited about tomorrow. My folks and I were just poring over the program for tomorrow and thinking just exactly that. Jan is like, wow, that person's already made such really cool stuff happening. And by the title of this session, I can see that they've got like a whole vision for a whole nother really cool project. So I'm really excited to hear from all of you over the next day and a little bit about everything that you're working on and all of the fantastic ideas that you have for what you want to work on next. And just really, really delighted to be here. This always fills my cup to come to the AERO meeting. And thank you so much for the invitation. you.